We're just going to wait one more minute for everybody to come in, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Matt Herbert. I co-lead the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime's focused research initiative on the use of targeted sanctions to counter transnational organized crime and corruption. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today to a launch event for a very important report that is being issued. It's titled On Target: Sanctions and Their Effectiveness in the Western Balkans, a Decade of Lessons Learned. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. We have Fatjona Medini, Ruggero Scaturo, and Adriana Pisarovic. I'll start with Fatjona. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Fatjona Medini, and I'm the director of the Observatory for Illicit Economies in Southeastern Europe at the Global Initiative.
Ruggero?
Hi, good morning also from my side. I'm Ruggero Scaturo. I'm a senior analyst at the Global Initiative, working for the Southeast Europe Observatory and also with the Europe Observatory recently.
Adriana?
Good morning, everybody. I am Adriana Pisarevic from Banja Luka. I'm an investigative journalist on media outlet Capital Ba. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And finally, our last two speakers, Claudio and Marchand.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. I'm Claudio Landi. I'm the head of digital projects at the Global Initiative to manage the creation of digital tools such as the one that we're presenting today.
Good morning to you all. My name is Merjan Daci. I am a journalist by profession, but I am a consultant for GI, and I've been working on the database of sanctions. Good to see you all.
Thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us. Before we proceed to the presentation on the report, I would like to offer a few framing points. Now, why is it that we're focusing on the issue of targeted sanctions now, and why in the Western Balkans? Over the last decade in particular, what we've seen is that targeted sanctions have become an increasingly used part of the international toolkit to counter transnational organized crime and corruption. And this really reflects a changing nature of the problem. Organized crime groups and powerful corrupt actors are more fluidly networked and transnational in operations than ever before. They're also increasingly a first-order threat to peace and stability, as can be seen most vividly in cases such as Haiti, as well as other countries throughout North Africa, throughout the Levant, and throughout Latin America. But crucially, corruption too can undermine states and pose a significant challenge. And we've seen sanctions rising to the fore, issued by a number of different states, most prominently the US, the UK, and Canada, as well as actors such as the European Union and United Nations, effectively converging in their use of targeted sanctions to counter these challenges, to counter organized crime and to counter corruption. It's also important to note that we've seen a growing breadth in the types of criminality, the types of activity that are covered by these sanctions regimes. If you look back 20 to 30 years ago, you saw an exclusive focus on drugs, mainly drugs coming from Latin America and mainly going to the United States. If you look at the landscape now, though, what you see is that regimes have been developed and designations issued targeting natural resource traffickers, cyber criminals, human traffickers, corrupt actors, amongst many others. Now, we at the Global Initiative assess that this trend of the rising use of targeted sanctions to counter organized crime and corruption is likely to continue and to expand in the coming years, including by the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States under President Trump's incoming administration. It's worth noting that sanctions evolved as an important go-to tool on crime and corruption during his first administration, and we see a likely continuity of that going into his second. However, our research has also underscored that the theory and the strategy around sanctions against crime and corruption remain heavily influenced by the sort of state-focused sanctions regimes, which have historically formed the dominant strain of sanctions approaches. And this, we think, is a problem, as there are very real differences, including in opportunities and in realistic goals, between sanctions on states and state-linked actors, and sanctions on criminal actors and those that, while they may be active within official roles, nonetheless are using those roles to corrupt personalistic interests. This has implications on how we assess impact, frame public expectations, and develop strategy within governments and between governments. For this reason, as the international community has moved forward on the use of this tool, we think that new ways of thinking, strategizing, and analyzing on impact on sanctions focused on criminal actors and corrupt actors is necessary. And to contribute to this, the Global Initiative has launched a focused research initiative on the use of targeted sanctions to counter organized crime and corruption. This cross-regional initiative draws on the field research capacity of the Global Initiative's 15 global observatories and the expertise of our staffers based in 42 countries around the world. And this has resulted in the development of a stream of reports and briefings over the last several years, of which the report being launched today is an important part. I should say that the website for our work broadly on sanctions is in the chat, as well as the link to today's report. Now, one crucial and foundational part of our approach to this research, and what you'll hear today in this report launch, is the development of a new framework for thinking about and assessing sanctions regimes on transnational organized crime and corruption. Traditional frameworks have tended to overlap the intent of individual designations with the broader aims of a given regime. Imposing targeted sanctions on an official in a state engaged in proliferation, for example, is intended to shift or impede individual behavior in order to ultimately build pressure on a state to change its behavior. We think that for crime and corruption-focused regimes, the objectives of individual designations and the strategic aims of regimes or groups of linked designations are separate and distinct. My colleague Ruggiero Scatoro will be going into more depth on this framework later in the presentation. I will say, though, that this differentiation is critical because it starts to point towards how we can better think through aims on organized crime and sanctions, both setting expectations for policymakers and the public, as well as how we design a strategy not just to counter crime, but also to counter corruption. Based on this framework, the Global Initiative's observatories have leveraged their field research capacity and expertise in organized crime to understand how sanctions are impacting situations at the level of individuals, as well as strategically on criminal ecosystems, in which corrupt state actors are oftentimes quite critical players. Now, our research has detailed how criminal ecosystems have been impacted and reshaped to varying degrees in Guinea-Bissau, the Central African Republic, and Libya. And this is distinct from the activity stopping in any given country, but we have seen various forms of shaping. And I think that today's presentation is really quite critical because it's the first time we presented a cross-regional assessment on the use of sanctions against organized crime and corruption. Supported by the government of the United Kingdom, this report's cross-regional focus is particularly key as we often see criminal ecosystems splaying across borders and the impact of sanctions in one country influencing how they're interpreted and reacted to in neighboring states. As will be discussed, sanctions in the Western Balkans are having a notable impact and shaping situations on the ground in that context. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the authors to go more in depth on what they found and why this is particularly key going forward. Thank you very much. And Fatjona, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this introduction. In fact, I would like to briefly talk about the evolution of the sanctions in the Western Balkans over the last 3.5 decades. This evolution, in fact, has been shaped by a mix of local and global factors. While working on this report, it became clear that there are two major periods that have defined the trajectory of the sanctions in the region. Next slide, please. Can we move the slide or? Okay, the next one after this. Thank you very much. Okay, so the first period spans from the early 1990s to the early 2000s and is closely tied to the wars and conflicts that follow the breakup of Yugoslavia and efforts to secure peace. It is important to notice that during the war period, then the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia has mainly sanctioned by the multilateral institutions like the UN and the EU, with a focus on embargoes for oil and weapons. As the conflict dragged on into the early 2000s, it became crucial to sustain a series of peace agreements that they were beginning to be put in place. As a result, at the start of the new millennium, sanctions became targeting organizations and individuals seen as a potential threat to stability in the region. During this period, the United States took a leading role in imposing these sanctions, reflecting so its significant involvement in brokering peace across the region. It is also interesting to note that from the early 2000s until the mid-2010s, no sanctions were imposed on the region. For more than a decade, this tool of foreign powers was essentially dormant when it comes to the Western Balkans. However, from the mid-2010s to today, sanctions have started to intensify again, with the United States taking the lead. This is a key period, in fact, we analyze in our report. And it's worth noting that the reasons during this decade for imposing sanctions have shifted significantly. While sanctions aimed at preventing destabilization in the region were reintroduced during this period, we also saw sanctions imposed for the first time on grounds of corruption and organized crime. This shift was largely driven by the growing recognition, particularly by the US, of corruption as a serious threat to national security. During this time, countries like the US and the UK updated their legislation, allowing them not only to impose travel bans on individuals accused of corruption, but also to expand financial sanctions to freeze more easily the assets of those involved in such activities. As a result, over the past decades, we have seen sanctions imposed on individuals and companies in the region, either solely for corruption or in combination with other accusations, such as organized crime and efforts to destabilize one country or the region. These accusations have been addressed through both travel bans and also financial sanctions. It is important to point out that while the US has taken a more active role in imposing sanctions, multilateral institutions like the European Union have been largely absent in this effort over the past decade, although the Western Balkan countries have in fact intensified their efforts to join the EU. And the same thing also could be said for the UN. Over to you, Matt, and I'm looking forward to speak a little bit more later.
Thank you very much, Fatjona. Now I'd like to present the floor to Ruggero Scaturo to present more of the findings from today's report. Ruggero?
Thank you very much, Matt, and also welcome again from my side. So as to begin with, the analysis that I'm going to present here employs a framework which has been developed by the Global Initiative, as Matt said, introduced, for targeted sanctions on illicit economies. So here, as you can see, it is a framework that examines the objectives and effects of sanctions at two interconnected levels. So the strategic goals and the designation objectives. Strategic goals on the right side of this graph address the broader aims and, in a way, the overall impact of a sanction regime or a related set of designations. In contrast, on the left side, designation objectives focus on the specific goals that are intended for a sanction imposed on an individual or entity, and also the effects that it wishes to achieve. In the context of this study, we have assessed whether the effects have been achieved from the perspective of the region. So we've done an assessment in order and also developed a methodology that would make us able to understand whatever level of effectiveness has been achieved from the perspective of the regional actors. As illustrated in this figure, the objectives of designation can contribute to one or more strategic goals. For instance, coercion, which aims to bring about behavioral change in individual actors and also their circles, their associates, can advance strategic goals such as disrupting organized crime or reshaping criminal ecosystem. And similarly, constraint and signaling objectives can also align multiple strategic goals. In contrast, the strategic goal of revelation of a given malpractice of a given crime, organized crime act, is instead primarily associated with the objective of signaling and revealing. Let me go to the next slide. So first, the role of sanctions and their ability or inability to induce behavioral change among targeted individuals or entities. This is a topic of significant importance, particularly when we consider how major Western powers like the US, the European Union, but also in general, the United Nations use sanctions as a tool for international policy. The primary goal of sanctions is clear, is to coerce behavioral change. Policymakers often anticipate, in a way, ambitious outcomes, such as compelling criminal actors to completely disengage from the illicit activities for which actually they've been sanctioned in the first place. While, of course, these expectations in a way are laudable, real world results tend to fall a little bit short. To take, for instance, the case of Slobodan Tesic, which is extensively also analyzed in the report, or the case of the North Macedonian mayor Ramiz Merko from Strud. Despite some signs of behavioral modification, outcomes rarely meet the high hopes that are placed on sanctions in the first place. So the question is, why do some sanctions succeed while others fail? One key factor that we have analyzed in our study is definitely motivation. Designated individuals often want to unfreeze, for example, the assets, regain access to the financial systems, restore their reputations, or even resume international travel in case of travel bans. So this pressure can really prompt some changes. However, as said, the impact really vary quite widely. In some cases that we have analyzed, sanctions have paralyzed operations and seen in Republika Srpska, but Andriana can definitely talk about this more in depth, where institutions here and communications have been literally disrupted. Yet, in other cases, individuals actually retain power, and in rare instances, even advance their influence. Cultural and systemic issues also, in a way, further complicate the effectiveness of sanctions. In some parts of the Western Balkans, for example, corruption and party clientelism weaken the impact. And there is also, in general, a pervasive expectation that those in power will exploit even their positions, and this undermines public confidence as well in sanctions. And without swift judicial action, many view sanctions individuals as victims rather than perpetrators, and this is something that we come across especially in a number of interviews. And of course, this is a perception that makes it rather hard to achieve meaningful changes. Sanctions also carry political consequences. For politicians, reputational damage can be severe, especially when they harbor ambitions for higher offices. We have, for example, come across in North Macedonia, political parties often distance themselves from sanctioned individuals to protect their image, but this is not really universal. Reactions really depend on factors like ethnic identity and also geopolitical alignment. For example, ethnic Albanians across the region with a strong pro-American stance respond to sanctions very differently from other ethnic groups in the region who are less influenced by Western pressure. The second slide here instead discusses how sanctions are designed to constrain criminal actors, focusing on their purpose, impact, and challenges. So constraint focused sanctions are not definitely, of course, secondary to those seeking behavioral changes. They have a distinct and crucial at the same time role. The primary aim is to disrupt the operation of criminal actors by creating frictions in key activities. For example, declaring someone persona non grata weakens the network and cuts times also vital connections, as seen, for example, in Kosovo, where sanctions against Radojcic and Veselinovic really severed the ties with collaborators from the ethnic Albanian majority in Kosovo. In a way, of course, this has produced an effect in reducing the influence in the region where they operate, in the areas of the region where they operate. Financial restrictions are also another powerful tool to constrain. Sanctions often target the financial system that criminal actors depend on. Banks, for example, under the threat of severe penalties, are quick to freeze accounts and then cut the ties with the sanctioned individuals. This approach really pressures legitimate businesses to at least distance themselves from these actors, effectively freezing them out of the formal economy. However, despite these measures, enforcement again in the region is not uniform, and this is something that also, as Matt was mentioning before, this is key is a key outcome when you have the possibility to compare countries in a broader region. In some cases, sanctioned individuals adapt by transferring assets, using intermediaries, or exploiting gaps in beneficial ownership registries, as observed, for example, in the analysis in the context of Albania and North Macedonia. Evasion tactics are, in fact, a major challenge. Again, to mention individuals like Radojcic in Serbia, he is a key example because he continues profiting through satellite companies, even after transferring formal ownership of assets. So these strategies really highlight the limits, in a way, of sanctions in states with weak enforcement or with political resistance. Despite these obstacles, sanctions do have significant institutional and political effects. In many cases, governments respond by severing ties with designated individuals. The case of North Macedonia, again, is key. For instance, where the State Commission for the Prevention of Corruption noted that blacklisted officials lose government protection and influence. However, inconsistent enforcement across regions diminishes, in general, the overall impact of these measures. So to sum it up, this slide, while constrained sanctions face challenges such as evasion and uneven enforcement, they really play a vital role in disrupting criminal operations. But to enhance their effectiveness, addressing enforcement gaps and strengthening international cooperation are really essential steps in this direction. Third, to conclude with the third objective, so signaling to different audiences, meaning how sanctions send messages basically to various audiences and influence also the public and institutional behaviors in a way. So signaling in general serves a dual purpose. While it often works alongside coercive or restrictive goals, it also is a standalone objective. For example, in Kosovo, the public designation of Veselinovic and Radojcic significantly impacted the political landscape. Public figures we have observed that have quickly distanced themselves from the sanctioned individuals, understanding also the risk of the reputational damage or even also legal repercussions. So this also is a reaction that underscores the credibility that Kosovo institutions and citizens place in US-led sanctions. In North Macedonia, instead, sanctions have led to tangible institutional responses. These nations have acted and still act as a wake-up call, also pushing local authorities to act. A notable case is, as I was mentioning before, the case of Ramiz Merko, which is the mayor of Ostruga, that we mentioned also in our report. And his inclusion on sanctions list prompted prosecutors to investigate long-standing allegations against him. This, in a way, suggested us that how sanctions can really pressure governments and in general, in this case, the judicial system to address gaps in enforcement, in capacity, or even in the political, in the general political will. However, at the same time, it also highlights a degree of dependence as well on external actors to initiate meaningful actions. Signaling also sparks legal reform debates, and this is key, something that we also have addressed for example, in the case of North Macedonia, where discussions are underway to incorporate even US and UK sanctions into domestic law, requiring prosecutors to act against sanctioned individuals. However, we have followed a little bit of the debate, and these are proposals that still actually face constitutional challenges, of course, with critics mainly concerned about potential misuse of power and the concentration of authority in non-judicial bodies. So while sanctions aim to send clear messages, their impact can be also distorted. In some cases, local audiences perceive them as a foreign interference rather than a targeted anti-corruption measure or anti-organized crime measure. And this is particularly true in politically polarized environments where governments use sanctions to rally domestic supports against external actors. A recent example is the response, for example, to allegations of weapon smuggling through the Serbian Orthodox churches. But instead of investigating and initiate investigations in general, Serbia's President Vučić accused the source of promoting external interests, reframing the issue as an attack on national sovereignty. So to conclude, while sanctions are as a signaling tool can drive change and expose institutional shortcomings, their success relies really heavily on accurate interpretation and also the relevance of the local context. So misperceptions risk undermining their impact, turning an intended message of reform into a rallying cry for resistance. And now I will give the floor back to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Ruggiero. Thank you very much, Ruggiero. I should say, as we go through this, for all of our audience members, if you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer dialogue box. When we get to the end of the presentation today, we'll be doing an extensive question and answers session. So there's a good way, if something isn't clear, if you have questions on an issue that has been touched upon, we can get more into it during the question and answer session. With that said, I'd like to give the floor back to Fatjona to look really at essentially what are the most common types of sanctions in the region, and what can we understand from a quantitative analysis of all of these put together. Fatjona?
Thanks again, Matt. So, as I mentioned earlier, our report focuses primarily on analyzing the last decade of sanctions in the region, covering the period from 2014 to 2024. To support this analysis, we have compiled data to form a quantitative overview. In this slide, we have created a dedicated database, which we will be presenting shortly. But before doing so, I would like to share some key insights and data on sanctions imposed in the region. In the last 10 years, a total of 167 sanctions have been imposed in the Western Balkans, 108 targeting individuals and 58 targeting companies. As shown in the graph, the vast majority of these sanctions, or 94%, have been issued by the United States, which accounts for 156 of them. The United States is followed on a much smaller scale, in fact, by the United Kingdom, which has imposed 7 sanctions. In most cases, these UK sanctions target individuals who were firstly designated by the US. We also need to consider that in reality, the number of the UK sanctions in the region could be higher. This is because for individuals involved in criminality and organized crime in countries like Albania, for example, the UK also carries out what it calls disruptive actions. These are measures imposed by the Secretary of State for the Home Department, which prohibit specific individuals from entering the UK. These actions are not announced publicly, but they are communicated privately to the designated individuals. As a result, we only have been able to count cases where individuals themselves have came forward and acknowledged being sanctioned by the UK. On the other hand, as you can see, sanctions imposed by the multilateral institution like the EU or the UN have been minimal. The EU sanctions have targeted only 2 Serbian citizens in the last 10 years for providing support to the governments of Russia and Belarus in the context of the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the UN has sanctioned just one individual, a Bosnian Salafist leader in 2016 for his involvement in Syria. Next slide, please. Corruption, either on its own or combined with other allegations, such as involvement in destabilization efforts or organized crime, has been the primary reason individuals in the Western Balkans have been sanctioned in the last decade. As I also mentioned earlier, this significant focus on anti-corruption stems from the growing recognition, particularly by the US, that this phenomenon poses a serious threat to national security. On the other hand, organized crime is also one of the most used grounds for sanctions. However, what is notable is that in a very few cases, individuals are sanctioned only for organized crime. Instead, in many cases, this accusation is linked with the other ones, such as corruption or efforts to destabilize a country or the region. Meanwhile, sanctions targeting effort to destabilize, often tied to accusations of facilitating Russian influence in the region, have seen a sharp increase after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As a result of the 45 the designations issued for destabilization alone or in connection with other allegations, 19 of them came after February 2022, which the war in Ukraine starts. Next slide, please. Well, the countries issuing sanctions have aimed to maintain a region-wide focus across the Western Balkans. Some countries in the region have been targeted more than others, without any doubt. As you can see on the screen, Bosnia and Herzegovina has the highest number of designations. The first bar represents the total number of sanctions, which in case of Bosnia is 56. The red bar represents individuals who have been sanctioned, while the yellow one indicates sanctioned companies. Based on the number of sanctions imposed over the past decade, Serbia comes second overall. Notably, Serbia has the highest number of sanctioned companies compared to other countries in the region, including also Bosnia. In both cases of Bosnia and Serbia, the primarily ground for sanctions have been allegations of corruptions, very often linked to efforts to destabilize the country or the region. There are also interesting cases like Albania, for example, where no companies have been specifically targeted by sanctions. Meanwhile, Montenegro, as you can see, has the smallest number of sanctions with a total of 5, 3 targeting individuals and 2 other companies. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Claudio and to Mershan to detail the database that the Global Initiative has put together that lists sanctions imposed in the Western Balkans over the last 10 years. Claudio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, Fationa. Thank you for having me. I'm going to quickly share my screen with this brand new sanction database that we're launching today along with the report. First of all, I would like to highlight and thank you all for your engagement on this Global Initiative conference room. That is our platform for webinars, our platform where we launch our studies, and it's very exciting to see this interest from our audience towards our reports, and not only our reports, but also the way we expand our research into accessible tools for policymakers and civil society, such as this one. This is the sixth tool that we launch from the Southern and Eastern Europe Observatory. There is another one that we're starting working right now for 2025, and but we will have a look at all of them later. This is the homepage of the sanctioned database that we're launching today, and from this, and the link to the database is accessible through the chat, so everybody now can go and browse by itself. We have a direct link also to the research report that to give a more complete overview of the research and the key findings. The website starts with an overview and a bunch of visuals that can help you get an overview of the sanctions that were issued to individuals and business in the region in the last 10 years, from 2014 until 2024, and those are broken down by different kind of visualization. We can have a country breakdown here, then we can immediately have an understanding of the countries that on which individuals and companies were most targeted by designation. We can then see a timeline with breakdown by years in the last decade, and as Fatjona was saying, we can immediately understand how designation increased after 2020, with anyway a particular spike in 2019 from the United States towards Serbian individuals and companies, and we will look at it later in more details. Moving on, we have a breakdown by, as we saw in the slides, by issuing entities, and we can immediately see that 93.9% of designation were issued by the United States. The typology of designation between individuals and business, with the vast majority targeting individuals. Institutions refers to institutions that are within that issuing entities. So, for example, we have a difference between the United States Department of State and the Department of Treasury, the Council of Europe, so specific institution within that issuing entity. And we can hover over the smallest percentage to understand what they mean. And then the pie chart related to the ground. So what is the criminal activity, destabilization activity in particular. And here we can immediately see that corruption, organized crime, and corruption by itself and destabilization also plays a very important role in all of this designation. After the overview, we can go to the sanction mapping tool that is a very thorough database of all the sanctions that are part of our research, and we can look at individuals that were sanctioned, what is the specific order, so what is the specific sanction that was issued and why. We can link to it, we will look at it later. First of all, I would like to focus on the filters here. We can filter, for example, if we are only interested in sanctions that were targeting individuals in Albania, for example, we can filter it and the system will narrow down the research to only Albania-related sanctions. And we can do that for all the countries or multiple countries at a time. We can filter by year as well. The issuing entity, for example, we want to see only the EU-related sanction. We can immediately see that the EU issued 2 designations in 2022, both towards Serbian individuals. And same goes with the typology, where we can see immediately business-related. These are all the business-related designations, and the businesses that were targeted, that are clickable and accessible through SPANA, and the ground where the sanction is targeting this individual on. So, for example, espionage, we can see that there is one company that was targeted for espionage and destabilization activities by the US Department of Treasury, and we can click on it, access that dedicated page to go to more details and access additional information on why this company was sanctioned and what are the activities that led to the sanction. There is also a link that goes straight to the source, and we can access the full text of the designation on the native website of the issuing entity. As I said, this is the sixth tool that we released from the observatories. I will drop the link in the chat. And so you can have, if you're not only interested in sanction, but in all also the other tools, you have a lot of choices here to look at, from the smuggling of migrants to illicit financial frauds and drug markets, maritime crimes, and football hooliganism. And then I leave the floor to Merchant. Thank you.
Yes, Claudio, thank you. So I want to emphasize that it was collecting the data for this database was it was an extensive and challenging task, because it was basically a manual work where you had to collect every single designation and then put every single detail to that. So for a period of 10 years, it was a number of 166 designations. So every designation also had to be accompanied with a link. So the idea now, the good part now, is that the database will be updated. So in a case we will be having new designations from these countries, the database leaves the space for new designations. For example, we also had the case of North Macedonia's last designations, Grubi and Begetis. So we added them. So we will be doing the same thing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mishan. So we've been talking about this cross-regionally so far. I think it's very valuable right now to focus in on one particular case, one particular country. And as Fatjona mentioned earlier in the presentation, the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina has seen some of the highest levels of designations over the course of the last 10 years. I'd like to turn the floor now to Adriana to focus in on the impact of some of those designations, what we've seen in terms of the impact on the ground, and some of the relevant lessons learned that can be applied across the region. Adriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I have to say that the United States imposed sanctions to our president, Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, in January 2017. And during these almost 7 years, nothing happened to him, and there was no consequences except that he couldn't travel in United States and not, or if he had any properties in United States, it will be frozen. And after that, in 2022, the sanctions were reintroduced against him and one media, Alternativna Televizija, that is one TV house that is used to be very respectful, but after changes of the ownership, it became one of the TV stations that is very, very pro-Dodik, and it is like some kind of his weapon for establishing his position and staying on the surface. So Dodik, first of all, got sanctions because of he disregarded decisions of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina and obstruction of Dayton Agreement. That was in 2017. 5 years later, he got sanctions for supporting his corruptive activities. Dodik has used and continues to use his official position in Bosnia to accumulate personal wealth through bribery and corruption. And his rhetoric, it is very ethno-nationalist, reflects his efforts to achieve political goals and distract attentions from his corrupt actions. So 1 year later, this was later in 2023, sanctions was broadened to his kids, his daughter Gorica and son Igor. These two persons, well, they are, this was because of ongoing corruption and misuse of public resources. They are owners of the companies that are making a lot of business with the country and get a lot of subventions, and they are helping their father to broaden corrupt activities along with extract public funds from for the personal enrichment. So after these sanctions, nobody was afraid because they meant nothing. They meant just that they cannot go to the United States or they cannot have any properties there. But situation got changed in March this year when Anna Morris, Assistant Secretary for Finance at the US Treasury Department, announced that more measures are expected in Bosnia against persons who undermine peace, stability, and territorial integrity of Bosnia. This led, firstly, to the transfer of ownership of the companies owned by Dodik's children to close associates and relatives so they can avoid the consequences of the sanctions. I believe that they had some information that they could be blocked, that their accounts in banks will be closed. So we started to investigate what is happening and what kind of consequences will be imposed to them. Very soon, in a course of the 1 month, Gorica and Dodik transferred their companies to the relatives, to the Gorica husbands, and they are still trying to find a way how to operate, because very soon all the banks that were that had their accounts shut their accounts. And then after a few days, the Infinity International Group from Banja Luka got sanctions. Not a few days, actually, in June. This was in June this year. Infinity International Group from Banja Luka is a holding company, was a holding company in Bosnia, directly or indirectly owned by majority of the stakeholder in at last 5 other companies. These are the IT companies: Prointer, Caldera. Caldera is a constructing actually company, Infinity Media, K2 Studio, that is Alternativna Televizija actually, and Una World Network. Since that, public focus remains on the sanctions to the IT companies, construction firms, and media houses that have been designated as a part of network supporting Dodik and previously receiving, and these companies are previously received hundreds of millions euros worth public contracts through the tenders. The company Prointer from Banja Luka received a total of 1,147 contracts with the state institution worth approximately 144.5 million euros. This company and the ownership of this company was somehow blurred. Somebody was owner of this company. This is some guy called, his name is George Juric, but nobody saw him. And a whole journalistic community and public believed that actually owner is Dodik's family, but they never admitted, of course. And in one point, Dodik said that his son is actually a counselor in that company, but he's not the owner. But we know, and we actually know that every public business that is important, that has big value, will go to Printer, and they were actually the favorite company in IT sector for the public tenders. So this company, among the largest contracts, there were a contract for establishing fiscalization system with the Republika Srpska tax administration. This was worth about 10 million euros. Also a contract with the government for an informational system worth around 1 million of marks. It is about 524,000 euros, and etc. Additionally, there was one other company, Sirius 2010. It's a company operating with the Dodik's family network that has never acknowledged being part of this group, connected to them. They found that company later, and that company actually got public contract for the fiscalization of entire Bosnia. But after the sanctions, that contract had to be stopped. And now we are not very sure what is going on, because some other company from Croatia got that business that was involved in that. But it should be, again, to be public announcement of choosing another company, not only to give them this big contract. So this Dodik network in past year often restructured corporate ownership. This is very important to know, because they are trying to conceal family involvement in companies and evade sanctions. For example, Prointer earlier took ownership of Alternativna Televizija in 2021, but quickly they transferred ownership to Infinity Media and then to K2 after OFAC sanctions to Alternativna Televizija. In 24, K2 was in the process of merging with Alternativna Televizija, where K2 absorbed and retained ATV assets, while ATV would cease to exist. So it is very, very complicated. They started after imposing sanctions to open new companies and to transfer property, contracts, everything, people, to another companies. And they thought, I don't know why, they thought that this is a transparent business managing. And they got a lot of people who was employed in those companies. They thought that transparent business is when you organize press conference and say, we are going to open new company and transfer all the business there. They thought that they can evade sanctions like that. It was, of course, impossible, because everything was corrupted before, and that's just impossible. So in the coming months, all these companies will have their accounts closed, leaving 1,000 workers unemployed, at least 1,000 people. The leadership of these companies will try and attempt to consolidate and re-register new firms to continue operations while taking ownership to themselves. George Juric, who was listed as an owner of Infinity Group, as well as Prointer, and immediately after sanctions that were imposed to him, allegedly left all behind and left from Bosnia. He said he's not interested in doing anything in Bosnia anymore. But somebody who got over 144 million euros worth of the contracts left everything behind and left from Bosnia. I don't think so. So this is something that we couldn't not yet find what happened, but we are trying to find. After that, they found a new holding called Invictus Technology Group, and it was established and brought together ProInter and Sirius. Their family Dodik claimed that Sirius is not their company and there's nothing with them. And after that, they brought ProInter and Sirius in the same company, but they changed the name of Sirius to the Nimbus. And they tried to open new accounts, but they didn't succeed. Actually, they got 2 accounts in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and 1 month later, those accounts were shut down. One company that was from Laktashi, named Caldera, was very much involved with Dodik family and with ProInter. ProInter actually bought over half of this company earlier, but after imposing sanctions, this company actually loses their account, and they try to do the same. Their workers actually registered a new company named Elpring, and that company takes over Caldera, while employees are registered as owners. But no, this is actually as well didn't work, and they got fired also. The interesting thing was with Una Media. Una Televizija was the media opened in 2021, I believe. It was a big regional project, and they got studio in Banja Luka, in Sarajevo, in Belgrade, and in Zagreb. Actually, their studio in Zagreb never started to work, but they were really, really in a big debt. So after they got sanctioned, they used this situation to shut down and fire all the people, and they used that situation to for convincing public that this is a direct consequence of the sanctions, but actually this was a consequence of the over 4 million euros of debt for unpaid taxes, salaries, and other things. New companies that were found, actually, so banks refused to open their accounts and close all of that they were. So in short period, all of these companies ceased to exist. It remains unclear what will happen with the public enterprises using software solutions from the IT companies that have ceased operations, as it's unknown who will take over support jobs and application maintenance. This is still an ongoing situation. We have a lot of applications and software solutions and systems that nobody knows who to call if he needs support or any help. So and institutions are refusing to tell us how they are handling this problem. So while this was going on field, our institution, our National Assembly, started to adopt new laws and changes of the current laws to help companies that are under the sanctions and the people who are on the US Treasury blacklist. So they adopted a set of laws in July enabling Investment Development Bank of Republika Srpska to conduct payment transactions and accept monetary deposits. So they wanted to enable for these companies that are under the sanctions to have accounts and to continue to work. But after adopting this law, nothing happened. They actually didn't form a payment transaction service, and probably because of the fear of that National Investment Development Bank could get also on the sanctions list. Office of Foreign Assets Controls later on sanctioned Vladimir Perisic and Elpring. Vladimir Perisic used to be a director of ProInter because they are attempting to evade US sanctions. We believe that this was actually a warning for all of those who are trying to avoid sanctions. All of this founding new companies, avoiding sanctions, transferring ownership, allegedly leaving everything behind and leaving from Bosnia was some kind of mask for continuance to do what they were doing earlier, getting out money from the public resources. So on the November last month, in the National Assembly came an initiative from these companies that are sanctioned to adopt a new legislation on internal payment transaction, compelling banks to open accounts to the firms on the blacklist, meaning their successor as well. So this means that they are tried through the National Assembly to force banks to open accounts to the sanctioned firms. And they asked that if bank refuses because of the reputational risk somebody to open an account, that it has to pay fines about 80,000 marks. It is like 40,000 euros. And this closing accounts and whole this situation happened this year made Dodik very angry, and he announced that he will soon come out with concrete data about banks and their manipulations. So he started some kind of quiet war with banks. So National Assembly started a little vengeance to the banks, and they and government actually adopted new rules for the billing in banks. So they forbid banks billing maintenance for the credit parties, for sending warnings for late repayments, as well as cash withdrawal at ATMs. So they cut off some income from the banks. Actually, we can also see this as some kind of warning to the banks that they are not kidding and that they will maybe broaden this little fight that is very quiet now. But these are really, really hard consequences of the sanctions, and everybody is trying to get his own place here. So besides Dodik and his children and these companies, half of the government of Republika Srpska is under the US Treasury sanctions because of their rhetorics, contacts with the Russians, because of the corruption. Mostly, all of them are in some way connected to corruptive contracts and with suspicious companies that only are there to withdraw public money. So there's a really, really long list of the people who are under the sanctions. And one thing for the end, persons who are on the sanction lists are unable to have bank accounts also. So they cannot get their salaries. So National Assembly accepted that those persons can get their salaries through the post office. So they are getting money from budget, from the public sources, but through the post office, because you can get payment without account under the specific circumstances. So they find the way how to avoid sanctions but not completely, because those companies stopped to exist. But we now have new informations. They are not confirmed yet, but we are doing on this, that they found cooperants, let's say that, cooperative companies who will help them to continue work in these IT companies and companies that are under the sanctions. They will borrow them, their name, their accounts. And this is a criminal act, but they will do that probably. And we have some list of 5 or 6 companies already that are involved in a new form of avoiding these sanctions. I think that I took enough time. I'm not sure if I have a minute or two.
Thank you very much, Adriana.
You're welcome.
I think that you've raised some really important and some really interesting issues that we'll circle back to during the question and answer time.
Okay.
What I'd like to do now, though, we've talked a lot about the framing of how it is that that sanctions are being used throughout the Western Balkans, their impact on the ground, and their impact in specific circumstances such as the Republika Srpska. I think it's key too to also have a forward-looking component. And so I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Ruggiero to go into some of the recommendations coming from this study. Essentially, what should the international community and actors within the Western Balkans be doing and be thinking of when it comes to targeted sanctions going forward? Ruggiero, the floor is yours.
Yes, Matt, thank you very much. Can you confirm that you see my slides? Yes, okay, cool. So these are, as you can see, is listed here, 5 major recommendations that we came up with, of course, based on the regional assessment that we have conducted. And of course, the goal of this recommendation is to try at least to maximize the effectiveness of the sanctions that are in place. So first and foremost, clarity of the purpose is essential. What we've seen is the sanctions regimes really have to articulate the strategic objectives clearly to all audiences. So questions such as why they are imposed, what outcomes they aim to achieve, and also how success will be measured must be answered explicitly. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that for many of those that have been affected, sanctions are seen as old news, carrying very little weight or impact. So to counter this perception, sanctioning jurisdictions must really explain not only the rationale for the designation, but also the broader implications for individuals and the entities that are involved. So in this sense, clear communication, which has to be done both internally and externally, is really vital. Moreover, when multiple jurisdictions implement parallel sanctions, we have seen cases with the same individuals and companies which are targeted by both, for example, the UK and the US, the objective and messaging should be really harmonized to avoid confusion and in general to bolster the credibility of the designation as such. Second, the timeliness and the resources that are allocated to the designations really matter. So sanctions must be enacted swiftly and backed by adequate resources. So recent cases have shown a tendency to target individuals who are no longer, for example, in official roles. And while this approach might seem justifiable, simply because of a time perspective, it can also inadvertently provide political leverage to these individuals, allowing them even to regain, to a certain extent, political support. So by proactively gathering intelligence and considering all possible scenarios and outcomes, sanctions can really disrupt harmful activities rather than, to a certain extent, also sometimes enable them. Number 3, the importance of monitoring public discourse. So sanctions are not, of course, implemented in a vacuum. They carry significant political implications, especially in regions like the Western Balkans, where we still, in certain areas, face clientelism and entrenched power structures that are still actually constituting a threat. So public criticism of sanctions often frame them as unwelcome interference by Western powers, which at the end of the day really undermines their legitimacy as well. So to counter this perception, sanctioning entities must actively monitor and address such narratives, while of course clearly outlining the consequences for those who undermine or flout sanctions. Number 4, this is imperative. Enforcement should not be negotiable. So sanctions, particularly those that have financial implications, are definitely powerful tools for enforcing behavioral change. Yet, their success really depends on robust follow-up. So local financial institutions must be held accountable for compliance, and practice should be unified across the region to ensure the effectiveness of the designation. Because inconsistent implementation really weakens the impact of those measures, especially in a region as interconnected as the Western Balkans. And then finally, what we have seen and we have perceived since the very beginning when putting together numbers, so doing actually even the quantitative analysis, we really believe that in a way that the European Union must step up. And that's because the EU has a unique role to play in the Western Balkans, given, of course, the region's reliance on the accession process for the future stability and general development of the region. So many sanctioned individuals maintain assets within the EU and frequently travel actually to the EU countries. And travel bans and asset freeze by the EU would definitely be significantly more effective than similar measures by, for example, the US or the UK. So this approach would also send a strong message to regional politicians. So behaviors that erode the democracy and destabilize society, and that are in a way against the very values at the core of the European Union, will not be tolerated also to its very close Western neighbors. And this was it. I won't talk more than that. So thank you very much. And now over to you, Matt.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ruggero, and thank you to all of our other presenters, to Adriana, to Fatjona, to Mashan, to Claudio. We're now going to turn to questions and answers. And what I'd like to do for this Q&A section, we've already gotten some questions into the Q&A chat box, but I invite our participants to type more in. And we'll go through those for about the next 15, 20 minutes to kind of touch on any issues that really haven't fully been teased out within this study. So I'm going to take the floor's prerogative and ask Fatjona, Adriana, Ruggero, an issue on strategy. So one of the things that we've seen elsewhere within the Global Initiative's work on sanctions is that sanctions often work best when they're embedded in broader strategies, using multiple different tools, using prosecutions, development aid, law enforcement assistance, all of the set of options states have available to them to address a defined problem. Within the Western Balkans, within the study you did, would you say that such strategic approaches can be kind of sussed out? Essentially, is there a strategy that's out there that is being used by the various international actors that have used sanctions? And are they crucially pairing different tools with their employment of sanctions towards one specific goal?
Matt, this is a very difficult question, I have to say, but I just want to build a little bit on also recommendations. And Ruggero mentioned quite rightly the fact that what we are seeing is an uneven implementations of the sanctions in the region. And in fact, this is a little bit paradoxical because also it comes from the same issuing entity. For example, we have financial sanctions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As Adriana explained, they were quite implemented or try to be put into force. And of course, they have created some consequences, sometimes unintended consequences, but there has been some pressure in that direction. What we're seeing, for example, in Serbia, it's a different reality. So while we are having the same financial sanctions also imposed by the US, we haven't seen too much pressure in following up with implementation. So I think this is an important gap that needs to be addressed if we want to have this strategic goal that you mentioned when it comes to sanctions.
Ruggero, Adriana, do you have some follow-up there?
Yes, I could say just one thing. I saw and I see that they are shook up with this last sanctions because they got cut from the pipe of the finances that came from the really good sector, IT sector. Nobody knows how much worth anything, and it's very nice and very you can smoothly write that value of this public business and or job is 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, and they could extract a lot of money without any question asked. But now they are very shook because they are aware that in their environment there are people who are really watching what are they doing. And in the announcements from the US embassies, when you read details, you can see that they know a lot of things that even journalists here have no idea of. So they are very well informed of what they are doing. So they are very, very much afraid about future consequences because we can see that it will be something probably. That's why probably our National Development Bank didn't actually establish the payment transactions system because they are afraid if this bank comes to the sanctioned list or our post office, they can actually come to the list. We are through with our institutions. So they have to be very much afraid and very thoughtful what their next steps will be. So they are very shook. And this trial against Dodik for the not implementing decisions of the High Representative now in Sarajevo could get him out from the politics. So they are on the very, very cold field, and they have to really be careful if they want to stay. So I believe they are these sanctions actually did their job well, but I believe it's going to be a lot more worse in the future for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Tatiana?
I want to mention something that in fact it was not mentioned here, but of course is in the report, and everybody can find more there as well. So is the fact that standardization of the implementation of sanctions is also important. I just also want to build on that a little bit furthermore, because, for example, we have the case in Serbia. So we have individuals that they have been sanctioned, and a few months later they have been promoted to ministers in the new Serbian governments. And there is not any kind of like big reaction from the US embassy there. So if these things would have happened in another country, of course, what we would have seen, it was much more reaction, much more intensification in terms of implementation also of financial sanctions and so on. So I think that I believe that we are measuring the impact of the sanctions in the region, but I think a lot of work needs to be done also from the issuing entities. And I think a lot of discussion about how their sanctions are really being landed and read from one case in another. Because I'm afraid that this kind of double standards that sometimes we have seen in the region, it's going to undermine also the impact and the effectiveness of sanctions in a long run.
Ruggero?
Just to go back to the original question regarding whether sanctions are part of a bigger strategy in general, and going back to the last recommendations about the European Union. It's interesting because when it comes to the European Union, of course, there are agencies as far as judicial cooperation and police cooperation are concerned. So Europol and Eurojust, they are actually particularly active in the region. Of course, the Western Balkan 6 are not part of Europol and Eurojust, but there are working arrangements. So we see constantly, we monitor, of course, police operation and cooperation between judicial bodies between East and West in Europe. And it's interesting that this level, I would say rather good level of collaboration between judicial institution and police forces that there exists, is not accompanied by a similar effort when it comes to sanctions. So it seems like something is missing here, and this is probably also why we also decided to include the specific recommendation. Paradoxically, there is more cooperation at the judicial and police level with European Union rather than the UK and the US, which on the contrary, instead the countries that issue more sanctions. So it is an interesting scenario, and we definitely recommend that also sanctions, so the EU also issue sanctions in order to also keep up with the same way that it's been working in the region in the last years.
To turn to a question on circumvention, because a lot of the discussion that you all brought up has focused on this issue of how designees have sought to get out from under sanctions, how they've sought to avoid them. I think one of the things on a lot of people's minds out there is the issue of cryptocurrencies and the role that they could play, not just in the Western Balkans, but globally. But in the Western Balkans, are cryptocurrencies being used to subvert sanctions? How can we think about these, and how are they likely to evolve in the future?
Mm-hmm. So our previous research has highlighted the growing use of cryptocurrency for money laundering in the region, particularly in hiding illicit funds. This also, without any doubt, poses a challenge to sanctions, as it allows financial sanctioned individuals, but also companies, to bypass traditional financial controls through decentralization and often anonymous transactions that happen with the cryptocurrency. To address these, future policies, in fact, need to focus on innovative solutions that enhance the effectiveness of the sanctions. One case step, for example, would be to requiring politically affiliated individuals to report their digital assets to anti-corruption agencies. This is especially important since they may use digital wallets instead of traditional bank accounts, particularly when assets are blocked in their home countries. And I think this, and I saw that there were several questions on the links between sanctions and cryptocurrency. I think all of these questions are valid, and I think more research and more reflection, and as I mentioned, also changes in policy are required in order not to let this development of cryptocurrency hamper the effectiveness of financial sanctions.
Thank you. Ruggiero? Is that
yes, very briefly. Yes, no, I just wanted to add on this because definitely the declaration of digital assets is key. Probably, of course, be the first step towards that direction. But at the same time, I have the fear that the more we focus and specialize on cryptocurrencies and the digital world, we might also have the problematic consequence of forgetting that we also talking about largely cash-based economies still. Adriana was talking before about the case of salaries being paid in cash via the post office, which is probably the most basic way of paying employees. So I would say that the fact that, of course, there are instances of cryptocurrency being used to avoid and to evade sanctions. At the same time, it is also important that the strategy shouldn't forget about the very basic and traditional ways of moving money in the region, which is still, again, also based on cash. So the one shouldn't be excluding the other.
So Adriana, do you have any points on cryptocurrencies that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, we do not have any confirmed informations about cryptocurrencies, but we had software ransomware attack on our medical healthcare system and also in the tax administration system. All of those was implemented by these companies that are under the sanctions, and one is not under the sanctions, but this company is very well connected with Dodik and his government. So our healthcare system was locked. The informations and data about citizens and patients were offered on the black market for selling, and it was locked for almost a month and a half. So we have an information that the hackers were asking for some cryptocurrencies for ransom, and they actually unlock it later on. So we believe that they got what they wanted to get. So actually, this was our first clue that our government and actually sanctioned persons are using cryptocurrencies. And if they are using it for the paying a ransom, and they probably are using it for other things, but we actually do not have new informations now.
So
They are actually still on the basic payments, post office, give me some cash, black bags, and that's it.
So really, there's a need to focus on multiple levels and understanding how circumvention operates. I think we've only got about a minute left, so to do, as we say in the US, a lightning round. So I'm going to pose one question to all three of you, if you could just answer very briefly. What's been the most unexpected shaping impact of sanctions that you've seen in your work? What is the one thing that has evolved because of sanctions that you would not have expected otherwise? And we're going to go in reverse order. So Adriana, then Ruggiero, then Fatjona.
I don't know. Everything is unexpected. One thing that they are maybe unexpected. The most unexpected thing that I see, it was they are convinced that they are innocent, and they are actually using these sanctions. They are using all of this situation to present themselves like a victims of somebody who is stronger than them and just using its power for some kind of force, nothing else. They are really, really into that idea they are innocent, and they believe that when they are using public money for personal things, that they are deserved that because they are doing such a good job for us. This is maybe the most intriguing thing here.
Ruggiero?
But probably how sanctions can be used by the designated individuals. I mean, some have really made a comeback into the national political scene. So, and also playing on this, being the victim of this very big Western devil that is playing with our lives here in our little region. This is something that in a way is not, I mean, I want to say that it's unexpected. It was actually expected, but still surprising to see how a designation which is very clear in its message is still getting, still making people able to get, a boost in their whatever political career they are pursuing or similar. So this is definitely something which at least is extremely interesting, the use of sanction.
Fatjona?
Matt, it depends from the environment, because what you can expect in one country, you cannot expect in the other country. And although we are talking about Western Balkans as a region, in fact, there are many different alignment and sensitivities in each of the countries of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans. What I can mention, in fact, is the fact that I and maybe many other people would not expect, for example, for some very high political figures, that sanctions would give some kind of good push, I have to say, to the judicial system, so they could open the case. And they could open corruption cases against them. So this was something, for example, that people would not believe. And I think that sanctions have really helped in this regard, because it's somehow from the public, it was expected that, so these allegations now need to be proved. And I think that this is a very positive development. So let's open court cases and see, in fact, if those persons are innocent or they are really engaged in corruption. So I believe as a good thing that sanctions has brought. On the other hand, in fact, it's also quite funny to tell also some efforts of some, especially politicians, sanctions in the region. They have thrown sometimes hundreds of euros in fact to lobby firms and to other actors. So in an attempt to undo sanctions and in an attempt to get delisted. And I have to say they have been largely unsuccessful. So we haven't, in fact, seen any delisting from the sanctions list in these decades. So these are some of the things that I can highlight.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. We've come to time, so I'd like to thank again our speakers, Fatjona Medini, Ruggiero Scaturo, Adriana Pisarevic, as well as Claudia Orlandi and Mershan Dasi. And I'd like to thank all of our participants, or all of our listeners as well, for staying with us over the last hour and a half. I should say you really need to go read the report. It's quite in-depth, it's quite interesting. And also look at the broader set of activities that the Global Initiative has going on around sanctions. I know this is something that we're going to continue to pursue, both in the Western Balkans as well as globally. And we look forward to bringing you more information, more analysis, and more recommendations on how to better the approaches by the international community to the exercise of targeted financial and travel sanctions in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.